Mina tydligaste minnen från golfrundan med Jimmy Åkesson var att vi pratade om integration. Och han menar på att vi har misslyckats med integration i Sverige. Jag sa att det kan vi inte ha gjort, det är omöjligt för vi har aldrig provat.
This is Navid Modiri, a podcaster, self-proclaimed conversation activist, and just an all-around awesome guy. I'm a big fan. Modiri is doing what should have been done in Sweden several decades ago. He unapologetically invites anyone, and I do really mean anyone, to his podcast who might be interesting to talk about certain often very sensitive topics like immigration, for example. And I really appreciate what he's doing, because it isn't easy. It isn't easy to open up to having a debate about sensitive topics with controversial people in Sweden. It's actually pretty dangerous. It can ruin your career, to be honest. But I'm still in this video going to do something as rare as to disagree with him. And the reason for this is that Modiri often says that, I quote, "We've never tested integration in Sweden," end of quote. And with that meaning that how can we then know that we've failed at integration? I'm going to start off by saying that this argument of his, which he's used repeatedly, is basically identical to the communist favorite defense of communism, which is, we've never had real communism, so how can we then be certain that communism doesn't work? It's a broken argument. X doesn't work, because we've never tried doing X the way I think it should be done, so how can we then say that X doesn't work? That's a type of reasoning behind this argument. Here's the way I see it. Integration is something which, in order to even be theoretically possible, needs to fulfill at least 4 prerequisites. The problem is that they never are, and that's why you get racial tensions and severe culture clashes. But we can still discuss these prerequisites and see where it all tends to turn sour, and why. So the first prerequisite is as follows. The group with which you try to integrate are similar when it comes to culture and societal norms and easily fit into the values which are expected by the native majority population. If we look at the first prerequisite, we already here encounter problems. A lot of the groups which we have allowed into this country share very little with the native population when it comes to values and cultural norms. All that we really share is the most basic human wants and wishes. For instance, we all want the well-being for our families to be furthered and to live our lives how we choose. But this isn't really a uniting force in any way. I'm actually being pretty generous here when I'm saying that it's something we share, because our definition of well-being for our families can vary drastically. Honor culture, for instance, is viewed as the protection of your family and the reputation within the community by people within that specific cultural context. But for people in the West, these cultural expressions are only viewed, rightfully so, as being primitive and brutal. And honor culture can also be very subtle. It doesn't have to be the type of honor culture where they murder their own daughters. But what about democracy then? You often hear that argument that we all can rally behind wanting to live with our families in a democracy. That is actually a common display of Western chauvinism, to believe that all groups of people consider actual democracy to be superior to everything else, because it isn't true. Take for instance all the countries around the world where people are living under Sharia law. There you are not able to further your own interests and well-being through the ballot, since the laws of the land have been formed by a man who people consider to have been given a divine mandate. And apparently, if we look at the statistics, a very large group of just that type of people is the type of people we're bringing into Europe, and they're okay with this. They're actually beyond okay. A lot of these people support implementing Sharia law in the West. That is not democracy, it's simply the tyranny of the sectarian majority. But in several Muslim Arab nations, Pew Research Center found that there for these people doesn't exist a conflict between wanting to live in a democracy, which the majority wants, but then also wanting to allow religion to completely control politics. They are completely unable to see a conflict in that. And of course they don't, since they all belong to the religious majority. That again in no way matches the Western, equal and secular definition of democracy. The minorities don't feel free in such a society. But those belonging to the religious majority think that everybody is free. So that is then also how they reply in surveys. So here's the second prerequisite in order to get integration to work in a country. The groups that you try to integrate into your society all bring something to the table that improves upon the already existing societal structure and economy within the nation. They have an ability to create wealth. So regarding the second prerequisite, we face an even greater obstacle. A majority of the non-Western groups which we have let into Sweden don't just have different values, they have worse values. There is very little a Middle Eastern or African country can offer a Western nation, both when it comes to technology and expertise, but also in the form of culture. I know this sounds like pure bigotry, but if we cut to shit momentarily, we can easily see that this is factually true. If we go back in time a couple of 100 years in the West, we would be more or less shoulder to shoulder with Afghanistan, Pakistan, or whatever is stan when it comes to our understanding of democracy, human rights, and science. There exist countries in these areas where the vast majority of the population think that you should be put to death if you leave the majority religion. And you could only ever find an at least somewhat similar attitude in Europe during the Middle Ages, when several European nations considered apostasy to be a crime equal to treason or mutiny. But again, in a survey from Pew Research Center, we can read that about 84% of Egyptians are in favor of making apostasy into a capital offense. In Jordan, 70% of its people think that stoning people for adultery is a great idea. And in Pakistan, 82% of the population think that cutting off the hands of thieves is a reasonable punishment. So instead of then having a criminal, you also have a handicapped criminal. That is probably going to make the situation way better. The majority of non-Western migrants come to Sweden from comparatively, culturally, and scientifically backwards nations. And I know this is not okay to say, but it is true. This backwardness has many different reasons. We have brain drain, wars, and cultures that are completely soaked in an oppressive and primitive religion. Because after these Arab nations historically created a golden age of scientific progress, the Arab Muslim majority states in the world today have a global net contribution to scientific literature of about 1%. Korea, for instance, between 1980 and 2000 granted over 16,000 patents of new innovative technology, while 9 Arab countries combined couldn't even produce 500 patents. If we take Spain, for instance, they translate more books per year than the entire Arab world has done in the last 1,000 years. And only 2 scientists in total from all Muslim countries have ever won a Nobel Prize in science. As a comparison, little Israel has won 12. But it isn't all their fault. The Western support for the concept of brain drain further regresses these nations. According to the World Health Organization, the average medical professional per 1,000th African is only 0.46. Only 3 African countries have 1 doctor per 1,000th citizen. What's even more depressing are the numbers from 2018 that are reporting that only 2 out of 10 immigrated doctors to Sweden actually passed the tests required from them in order to practice medicine. That's pretty sad. Out of 608 dentists who came to Sweden these last years, only 27 passed the test needed in order to be allowed to work as a dentist here. Out of 964 immigrated doctors, 263, about 27%, passed the test needed to be a doctor in Sweden. We also then should mention that these doctors can be immigrants from anywhere, not just the Arab nations. So which nationality do you think that these 263 doctors belong to? Germany and the UK have some of the best medical schools in the world. Yemen and Afghanistan, not so much. But we can just be polite and say that we simply don't know who these doctors are that are failing these tests. So despite in practice incentivizing medical professionals to leave their countrymen, specifically in African and Middle Eastern nations, we're not really getting much of a payoff for it. So while the pro-immigration crowd in the West are cheering about immigrating professionals, people are suffering to a far greater degree in the immigrants' home countries. In some African countries, you have about a 75% immigration rate of people with higher education. So the countries pay for educating these people, and then they just bail. They go up to Europe or America or whatever. And then people wonder why these African countries have severe problems. Since the dawn of time, new members of any group quickly had to contribute with any knowledge and skills that they had to, in some way, reward the majority for their acceptance and protection. This doesn't happen today with these groups. In a lot of ways, it's a one-way street kind of relationship. It's a lot of taking, but not a lot of giving. And I know it sounds mean and I'm a terrible person and yada yada yada, but that is the case. And these type of relationships are not sustainable when it comes to any interaction between any groups of people. It's like any relationship, you can't just take and not give in an equal amount. But there does exist a couple of exceptions. The influx of Iranians we received following the Iranian Revolution, for example, greatly contributed to Sweden. Iranians are, as a group of non-Western migrants, overrepresented when it comes to having a university degree. They are also often secular, probably due to their violent history regarding religious zealots, and as few as 5% of Shia Muslims with an Iranian background in Sweden actually are active practitioners of Islam. But our biggest non-Western immigrant groups statistically have a lower level of education than native Swedes and a higher unemployment rate, which makes, is obvious. Iraqis, which are one of our absolutely largest groups of immigrants, have a literacy rate in their home country of about 50%, and only 9% of the country's total population has ever gone to secondary school. So when we compare this to Sweden's 99% of literacy rate for people above 15 years of age and 84.4% of people who completed secondary school, you maybe more easily understand why we face problems acquiring any form of net profit from these people. And I know that people flinch when you start talking about human beings and profit, but in order to be able to successfully run a country and have a sustainable economy, we need to talk about these things. Prerequisite number 3. Integration with these groups has to be voluntary for the native majority population, because you cannot force integration without being oppressive. There should have been referendums. Nothing regarding the mass migration, which from the beginning was set in motion by Sweden's Social Democrats, has been voluntary for the people of Sweden, period. They voted for the politicians, that is true, but they did not vote for the policies, which were later set in stone. In 1975, the Social Democrat leaders of Sweden, as one of the first governments in the world, institutionalized the concept of multiculturalism and moved away from Sweden's previous policies regarding immigration, which, like the US, had been centered around the idea of assimilation and to primarily allow the immigration of workers or genuine asylum seekers. And early on, it was clearly stated for all to read that the burden of achieving successful integration in this now multicultural Sweden would rest entirely upon the shoulders of the ethnic Swede, and that there would be no demands laid upon the immigrant regarding to which degree he or she chooses to integrate into society. So you can maybe see what I'm talking about here when I'm saying that this relationship between the native population and the immigrants has always been a one-way street. The ethnic Swede was expected to make this work, while there were no expectations on the immigrants. So I'm going to argue that already in 1975, the fuse had been lit to the powder keg that we're seeing about to go off in Sweden today. A severely fractured country in which we, beside outright animosity towards foreigners, are also witnessing an increasing amount of in-group fighting between the natives. There also exists no evidence anywhere in support of the claim that diversity through institutionalized multiculturalism in any way actually improves upon the lives and living conditions of the citizens in a nation.
In this book, you assault it head on. You describe it as a barrier to progress and a lot of other things. Explain why multiculturalism, if you would, is bad.
I guess it starts from a false premise, which is that there's something that all cultures are equal in some undefinable sense, which has never been the case. I mean, some cultures are better at some things, worse at other things, and at particular times in history, one group's culture may be ascendant and another time another group's. But what you almost never see is what they assume is a norm, namely all groups performing pretty much the same in all kinds of fields across the board. That you can go through centuries of history without finding a single example of that.
You say that assumption, in fact, holds different groups down. You write, quote, multiculturalism, like the caste system, paints people into the corner where they happen to have been born, but at least the caste system doesn't claim to benefit those at the bottom.
Absolutely. So when the multiculturalists say, for example, that the schools should not try to make black students speak standard English, the difference between speaking standard English and not speaking standard English can be huge in terms of your job, your careers, and all sorts of other things.
A whole plethora of different areas within a nation's body suffers from the ideas about diversity, tolerance, and the bigotry of low expectation in order to not oppress people from a different culture by putting demands upon them. There exist several examples of where multiculturalism severely damages nations, and they're not even difficult to find. Kenya is a good example. In Kenya, there exists a lot of ethnic diversity, and identity politics and tribalism severely stagnates the democratic process within the nation. Somalia suffers from similar problems. Although being culturally and racially more homogenous, they're still having conflicts arise from the nation's clanism. How well this type of clan mentality is going to integrate with Western nations' idea about a mass group identity bound to citizenship and nationality is fairly easy to predict. The solutions for these issues are complex, and if we're trying to integrate groups who have a very tribalist and limited type of in-group loyalty, we're going to face problems. These groups might function in workplace environments or interact with colleagues on an at least superficial level, but any in-depth relationships are still exclusively within their own group. You will not have any integration. You're going to have tolerable segregation. So the damage caused by the choices of the Social Democrats in the 70s will for the Swedish population take decades to repair. And it comes as a direct result of shifting focus from expected assimilation to optional integration and ideas about multicultural nation. The moderates aren't without blame either. I'm gonna beat them up also, because early on they supported these insane ideas since they liked the idea of having a fresh influx of easily exploitable workers who wouldn't bitch and complain about working conditions like the native Swedes, who often were members of unions. They've seen this development since the 1930s and naively believed that it would benefit employers, no matter of the immigrant's country of origin or educational background or culture. Wage dumping has been a goal for a long time for the moderates, and mass immigration is an excellent way to do it at the expense of the Swedish working class. I've actually had the pleasure of having conversations with sane people on the left who are against mass migration based solely upon this reason, that it severely hurts the working class. And it's nice to at least agree upon something. So here's the fourth and final prerequisite of this video about how to make integration actually work. The group with which you try to integrate have a high level of cultural receptivity. So this is where the whole process of ever achieving integration, at least with some groups that are often tragically large, completely jams. Cultural receptivity means to which extent an individual is open to accepting new ideas, norms, and accepting new ways of thinking. Now this is among certain immigrant groups extremely low. Despite coming from countries that are bare testament to its dysfunctional society and cultural norms and flawed forms of governance, people from these parts of the world who come to Sweden still think that their way of life is superior, even though they have absolutely nothing to show which supports this claim. And they have a national pride, which is frankly bizarre considering how the often bloodthirsty regimes in their home countries have treated them. Some people attribute the difficulty to integrate certain groups into Swedish society as being a question about societal norms not having been explained to immigrants properly, which is an excuse I'm not buying. What is certain though is that specific groups integrate better into society than others, probably because they don't integrate in the Swedish meaning, they assimilate. The Sikh, for instance, are exceptionally good at it, largely due to their culture and their religion, which has as a fundamental pillar of their faith to show an understanding for other people's way of thinking. The same applies also to Jews and Southeast Asians. All of these groups have historically and currently are very good at adapting to whichever country they move. So with this in mind, should we, for the sake of ever achieving this dream about functioning integration, begin to handpick the countries from which you are allowed to immigrate? That's a question we should ask ourselves. Or should we keep the floodgates open because the Social Democrats are bullshitting us about tightening the borders? That's a lie. And blame any conflicts which will inevitably arise on simply being misunderstandings, and that Swedes simply need to try harder to make this work. Because the Social Democrats are not going to close down our borders. Despite saying that they've tightened up our immigration policies, they still take in ridiculous amounts of people considering the problems we already have with immigration in this country. In the end, we have tried integration, Navid. We've tried it since the 70s. Integration didn't work back then. What we used was assimilation. That worked. The problem is that we started later with deception when we started talking about multiculturalism and integration, because the Swedish people were never asked if this was a type of Sweden they wanted to live in the future. We never voted upon this, on making Sweden a multicultural nation. So there's been denial, deception, and now we've moved on to fear and panic and doubt. We started it in the absolutely worst way possible. We moved away from a formula that works, that there exists evidence that assimilation works. We moved away from that to the chaos we have now. There exist no historical examples of successful integration, but we know just from Sweden's history that unconditional assimilation can work. We can achieve a tolerable situation. I have in videos used the term integration before, but I regret doing it. After witnessing the development in Sweden these last years, I've completely lost faith in the modern definition of integration and the concept of integrating drastically different groups. But if you, despite this, want to give it another go, we first need to begin to send people home who refuse to assimilate and who have no reason to be here very often. This needs to be done. We also need to acknowledge that certain groups of people assimilate more successfully and take that into consideration when we establish our future policies regarding immigration. The Swedish native population should also be more involved in the policy making because this affects everyone living here and it affects future generations, and Swedish people should be able to say what they think about it. I'm working on a video now which will go more into detail about how we could fix the mess we're currently in regarding our situation with this failed integration, because it has failed, Navid. We disagree on that. It has failed. It's a failing formula. I recommend Navid Modiri's excellent podcast, because it is excellent. I'm not just gonna trash this guy. I love his work, highly respect him. You should check him out. He also has a few videos that are in English. I wish he had more, but to my Swedish viewers, if you don't know about him, go in and check out his podcast. It's awesome. Thank you very much for listening, and I also want to thank my patrons who, among many things, helped me fund this sweet microphone that I'm using to record this video. I don't know if you've noticed the difference, but I think it's a difference. I don't have to edit away huffing and puffing and hissing like I used to do, not to the same extent anyway, so thank you very much for that. Until next time, take care.